This book caused the greatest uproar in scientific circles in the 20th century. It is called Worlds in Collision and was published in April 1950. It was written by Emanuel Velikovsky, a Russian-born Jew, who immigrated to the United States. While Worlds in Collision was at the top of the bestseller list, its publisher, Macmillan, sold its publishing rights to Doubleday and Company just 2 months after the book's appearance. Macmillan had come under intense pressure from the scientific community to stop publishing the book, or else they would boycott Macmillan's textbooks. Although Macmillan was committed to publishing diversity of thought, they eventually stopped publishing all of Velikovsky's books by the end of 1952. At that point, Doubleday and Company reissued the book. Velikovsky was an evolutionist and an atheist, but held unorthodox views about Venus. He believed that Venus had been a mass ejected from Jupiter, which became a kind of comet planet. His most controversial claim was that Venus began its existence in the 15th century BC, not the billions of years ago as evolutionary colleagues believed. Velikovsky also believed Venus came into close contact with the Earth a number of times, and because of interactions with the Earth, developed an eccentric orbit which in time circularized. Where did Velikovsky get his ideas? He began with ancient historical records. One of them was the Bible. Velikovsky didn't believe in the Bible the way a traditional Christian believes in the Bible. After all, again, Velikovsky was an atheist. But he did believe in his own way in the Hebrew exodus of Egypt. This was when the Jews left Egypt and escaped their slavery. Of course, he didn't believe the exodus came about from God doing 10 supernatural miracles. Velikovsky saw that as just a story, a kind of fantastic narrative created by the Jews to explain the role of their God in the exodus. Rather, Velikovsky said that the exodus was caused by a close encounter with Venus, a cosmic disturbance that surrounded and affected the Earth, resulting in things like volcanism, atmospheric disturbances, famine, pestilence, all of which decimated Egypt. Velikovsky's contemporaries dismissed his book as craziness. One of Velikovsky's critics in later years was Carl Sagan, an astronomy professor from Cornell and host of the extremely popular series Cosmos. Sagan embodied the criticism of Velikovsky's opponents. The idea that Venus came into existence just thousands of years ago was, quote, silly, and, quote, a gross distortion of the facts, said Sagan. In episode 4 of Cosmos, called Heaven and Hell, Sagan gave 6 arguments against Velikovsky. 1, Sagan said that the idea that a mass was ejected from Jupiter was unrealistic. 2, Venus was poor in hydrogen, while Jupiter was composed of almost nothing but hydrogen. So how could Venus come from Jupiter? 3, Sagan said that volcanism was not much present on the Earth in the 15th century BC. 4, Sagan said that planets are like grains of dust in space, far removed from one another, making it very difficult for them to come into close contact of any kind. 5, Sagan said it would be essentially impossible that Venus could come close to the Earth, much less interact with the Earth in any way that would result in the kind of circular orbit Venus has today. 6, Sagan claimed that Babylonian records showed that Venus had a circular orbit before the time when Velikovsky said Venus was ejected. For different reasons than what Sagan offered, I too for many years did not believe that Venus had come into existence suddenly. The reason was because as a Christian, I didn't see anything in the Bible supporting it. But I did appreciate one facet of Velikovsky's work. He points out that ancient historical records from many major cultures all agreed that the year was 360 days long. And I believe the Bible teaches that. In fact, Velikovsky points out a number of biblical passages to show that months in Genesis and in 2 other books of Moses were 30 days. For example, in Genesis chapters 7 and 8, 150 days are said to be 5 months. My conversion to the idea that Venus's birth was recent came through the back door. I didn't even realize it at first. I'd come across a statement by Richard Parker, America's leading expert in Egyptian calendrics from the 1950s to the 1990s. He pointed out that the Egyptians, who had a different name for each of the 30 days of the month, called the 18th day the day of the moon. Parker was puzzled. He knew that Egyptian records held the 7th day and the 23rd day to mark the 1st and 3rd quarters of the moon respectively. Yet he believed that full moon might be reckoned anywhere between the 14th and the night of the 17th day, possibly called the 18th day. He ends by stating, "This last seems to indicate some importance was attached to the 18th day, but other than that its meaning is unclear to me." But we have to ask, how could the 18th day really designate full moon? For halfway between days 17 and 23 is the dividing point between the 15th and 16th days, not the 18th day. It was at that point I thought to myself, I wonder if this day of the moon on the 18th of the month has something to do with the moon standing still during the Joshua miracle. Many people my age are more likely than younger people to have some idea of who Joshua was. People older than me remember Bible reading in public schools until 1962. And for decades, ABC television has been running the movie The Ten Commandments around Easter time, starring Charlton Heston. In the movie, an actor portrays Joshua, who was the protege of Moses. Joshua is best known for something he did 40 years after the Exodus. He commanded the sun and moon to stand still during a battle so that daylight would be extended. The Bible says the miracle lasted like a day. The Bible also says that God never before or since hearkened to a man's voice to that extent, yet did on this occasion because he fought for Israel. Interestingly, in Joshua 10, it says that great stones fell from heaven, which destroyed more of Israel's enemies than the children of Israel killed. Well, sometime after learning about the Egyptians calling the 18th day the day of the moon, I came across a mention of a creationist astronomer who I knew dismissed Velikovsky's idea of a 360-day year. This upset me, but at the same time, I asked myself what it was that I disagreed with about Velikovsky. And I realized it was this idea about Venus coming into existence recently. And I began to think of the Joshua miracle and wondered if somehow this might account for Venus coming into close contact with the Earth. After a day or so, I arrived at an answer that satisfied me. Here it is. If Venus was here on virtually the same orbital path as the Earth, but behind the Sun, here's what could have happened during the Joshua miracle. Instead of the Sun coming to a halt in the sky, the Sun could have followed the Earth in its rotation, making the Sun appear to stand still. And the same with the Moon. Both would have revolved around the Earth for about 24 hours, making it seem like it stood still in the sky. So what would have happened to Venus? It would have been pulled by the sun. So the sun's going around the Earth this way, and so it's pulling Venus as the sun travels around the Earth. And so the sun goes around the Earth, and as it does so, it pulls Venus along the Earth-Venus orbital path, coming into close contact with the Earth 12 hours after the beginning of the Joshua miracle. The reason Venus did not collide with the Earth is because of a difference in apogee or perigee or even inclination. While this was happening, I believe God kept the Earth in situ, relatively unaffected by the miracle. I think Venus also came close to the Moon. Here's why. On the 18th day of the month, the Moon would have been past full moon. Imagine if the Moon is at the tip of a minute hand on a clock and the center of the clock is the Earth. When the minute hand is at the 12, it's new moon. It is between the Sun and the Earth. And if months were exactly 30 days back then the movement of the Sun should be placed 2 seconds counterclockwise each day. So in 30 days, it would be new moon again. So at 9 o'clock would be the first quarter, 6 o'clock would be full moon, and 3 o'clock would be the third quarter. So the 18th day would be 18 times 2, or 36 seconds, counterclockwise from the 12. That puts it here. However, the Bible states in Genesis 1 that evening and morning were the first day, evening and morning the second day, and so on. This implies most, if not all, Mediterranean cultures would have regarded the evening as the beginning of a 24-hour day, because full moon came exactly between the end of the 15th day and the beginning of the 16th day. In other words, at evening on the 16th day of the month. So the morning of the 18th day places the moon 1 less second counterclockwise than 36, because we're not at the end of the 16th day, we're only midway into it. That's why the moon, or the tip of the minute hand, is pointing to the 5. And remember, the moon too is traveling around the Earth in 24 hours, and so 12 hours into the Joshua miracle, where would the moon be? It would be 30 seconds from where our minute hand is, or here at the 11. Not all that far from where new moon would normally be. We'll come back to the moon in a moment. It's worth noting that the French classical scholar, Ferdinand Crombet, translated some Egyptian hieroglyphics in this way. Quote, "The sun, thrown into confusion, had remained low on the horizon, and by not rising, had spread terror amongst the great doctors. 2 days had been rolled into one." Unquote. Jerusalem is about 40 minutes east of Cairo, so an Egyptian morning where the sun stayed low on the horizon fits well with when Joshua would have commanded the sun and moon to stand still. For he could see in early morning that the battle would not be finished before daylight ended. Also, in the days after full moon, the daytime moon only appears in the morning. so Joshua could not have commanded it in the evening. So if this is correct, it means Joshua would have commanded the sun and moon at about 1 or 2 hours after dawn, or about 14 hours from the beginning of the 24-hour day, which began in evening. Let's say this was the 18th day of the month, and that the Egyptians named it the day of the moon because the moon stood still. And then Venus appears 12 hours later, speeding along its orbital path at 360 times its normal speed, or 24 million miles per hour. And so coming into view on what? At about the first or second hours into what should have been the evening of the 19th day of the month. Except remember, it's daylight. But all the Babylonians would have needed was a clepsydra or water clock to tell them it was technically the next day of the month. And so we have a harmonization between the Egyptians' 18th day of the month called Day of the Moon and the 19th day of the month, which Velikovsky points out is the day the Babylonians give as the birth of Venus. Velikovsky notes that of all the planets, only Venus has a birth mythology common among all the major ancient cultures on both sides of the ocean. This also explains why early Babylonian astronomy only knew a 4-planet system besides the Earth. The planets were Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Venus is never mentioned. Now we know why. It's not for the reason most evolutionists claim, that Venus was a triumvirate with the sun and moon and so excluded from mention among the planets, because such a triumvirate is never hinted at in Babylonian records. But that doesn't stop evolutionists from suggesting it. Incidentally, it was many months later when I stumbled across a verse in the Minor Prophets about Joshua's miracle. The prophet Habakkuk in chapter 3 is recounting various miracles that God did on behalf of the Jews. Verse 11 is very striking. Quote, "Sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear." This is typical Hebrew irony. At first, the prophet is speaking from the observer perspective, like we would say, the sun is setting or the sun is rising. Habakkuk is saying the sun and moon stood in their places. But then he goes on to tell you exactly what happened, what the mechanism was. They went away. They moved. And if they moved in such a way that they appeared to stand still as observed from the earth, it has to mean they went around the earth as the earth revolved. And as Venus followed the sun, the extreme centrifugal force would explain how Venus began throwing off planetary matter. Some of this went through Earth's atmosphere and was reduced in size to the large stones that the book of Joshua mentions. Velikovsky quotes a Mangayan legend from the Cook Islands that says that with the birth of a new star there came many fragments of stones. And elsewhere, Velikovsky asks, quote, "Are Hebrew sources silent on the birth of a new star in the days of Joshua? They are not. It is written in a Samaritan chronicle that during the invasion of Palestine by the Israelites under Joshua, a new star was born in the east. Quote, a star rose out of the east against which all magic is vain." Unquote. Let me say in passing that the Joshua miracle may also account for the asteroid belt and the disappearance of water from Mars. 1 or 2 smaller planets between Mars and Jupiter, totaling a quarter size of our moon, might have imploded during the miracle, producing the asteroid belt. Or maybe the asteroid belt is composed of planetary throw-off from Venus and Mars, or a combination of these. And for Mars, its atmosphere could have been ripped away, with most of its water estimated by NASA to originally be about the size of our Atlantic Ocean, because Mars is also being pulled with the sun. At any rate, at least some of Earth is pummeled by Venus's debris. But note that the size of the debris is not on the scale of what many creationists believe was the size of the meteor or meteors that caused the great fountains of the deep in Genesis to open up and flood the earth in Noah's time. So let's look again at the moon. Given its position 12 hours from the beginning of the Joshua miracle, it now has its backside exposed to Venus's loss of matter. And notice that the dark side is pretty much evenly pockmarked. There's not the kind of deep penetration that we see on the near side of the moon, where penetrating meteors caused huge lava flows to open up, in at least one case to the size of the continental United States. This unevenness in the pockmarking of both sides of the moon is a problem for evolutionists, since it is assumed that in the course of billions of years, both sides of the moon would show the same amount of meteor impact. And so evolutionists imagine that in the moon's ancient past, it was a little smaller than today, and that a smaller moon trailed it and eventually merged with it, and in so doing turned the moon a quarter of a turn, making the dark side of the moon denser, and so less likely to produce lava flows from meteor impacts. So what are we to think? Do we accept that ancient records can be harmonized in reasonable ways? or accept explanations by evolutionists determined to ensure their theory is unfalsifiable. But in fairness, I think most of Sagan's arguments should have been conceded by Velikovsky. First, Sagan said it was unrealistic that a mass could be ejected from Jupiter like Velikovsky supposed. Sagan made that statement in 1980. In 1994, interestingly enough, when Sagan was still alive, a huge meteor made a big splash on Jupiter. Had it hit the Earth, it would have destroyed it. So we can imagine that maybe something the size of Venus could be ejected in the course of billions of years that evolution proposes. So I would call that more or less a tie between Sagan and Velikovsky. But of course, Sagan's objection doesn't affect our biblical model at all. For in the biblical model, Venus was created at the same time as all the other planets. Second, Sagan complains that Venus is poor in hydrogen while Jupiter is rich in hydrogen. While that's a problem for Velikovsky, it's not a problem from the biblical view because Venus is composed as God originally composed it, poor in hydrogen. Third, Sagan said there was not much volcanism in the 15th century BC. The biblical view doesn't require that there be volcanism in the 15th century BC, but Velikovsky would probably need to concede that argument to Sagan as well. Fourth, Sagan said the planets are like grains of dust and therefore virtually impossible to come into contact with each other. Sagan makes clear that his problem with Velikovsky's idea of Venus's origin is that anything so major could happen so recently. This is because in evolution, sporadic changes, if there are such, take place far apart over millions and billions of years. If I were an evolutionist of the standard variety, unlike Velikovsky, I would agree with Sagan. Velikovsky was a catastrophist and historian, which is why, despite the odds, he believed that traditional evolutionary theory was wrong about Venus. But for us of the biblical view, we believe that biblical and certain extra-biblical records show that Venus's origin does not require billions of years. However, we would concede that among traditional evolutionists, Sagan makes a strong argument against Velikovsky. Fifth, Sagan says that it would be extremely unlikely that Venus could interact with the Earth in such a way as to produce the circular orbit of Venus. Sagan even mocks Velikovsky's theory as a kind of cosmic pinball. Perhaps Velikovsky ought to concede this argument to Sagan as well. However, in the biblical model, Venus began with a circular or near circular orbit, and after interacting with the Earth and going into an elliptical orbit, as shown in the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, eventually recovered to something like its former circular orbit in something similar to the way a spinning top does when it's hit and spins erratically, but then shifts to something akin to its former circular spinning. So I feel that we can concede, in a sense, the first 5 arguments of Sagan against Velikovsky, understanding that we're not endorsing Sagan's evolutionary views. So in all these 5, we're saying the biblical model goes a long way toward answering Sagan's objections against Velikovsky. Sagan's 6th point, however, is a serious misstep. He tells his viewers that Babylonian astronomy showed Venus's orbit to be circular before the 15th century BC. Sagan makes this statement in the kind of tone a meteorologist would tell you that yesterday we had a 1/4 inch of rainfall. He doesn't cite what Babylonian record he's talking about. In fact, it took me a moment to realize he was referring to the Venus tablet, which shows an erratic elliptical orbit. This is because the Venus tablet is a historical record of Venus's synodic cycles. This cycle is how long it takes Venus to lap the Earth because Venus's orbit is closer to the Sun. Every 584 days, Venus laps the Earth one time. The Venus tablet records 12.5 of these cycles. They state the month and day that Venus first appears low on the eastern horizon, how it rises each day before becoming invisible because of the sun's glare, as Venus prepares to go behind the sun. So Venus travels behind the sun and comes out of the sun's glare high in the western sky where it is visible again, and each day it falls a little lower in the sky until it disappears in front of the sun or the sun's glare. And then it travels in front of the sun until it comes out again low on the eastern horizon. Today the cycle is 263 days in the eastern sky, 50 days behind the sun or sun's glare, 263 days in the western sky, and 8 days in front of the sun or sun's glare. And then it appears again low on the eastern horizon to begin a new synodic cycle. The total is 584 days. But the average synodic cycle in the Venus tablet is about 620 days, more than the approximate 584 days of today. Now to hear Sagan tell it, you would suppose the Venus tablet recorded the same length of days as we have today. After all, he states blithely that Venus had a circular orbit by the 15th century. But that's not the case. The actual numbers given in the Venus tablet for the eastern sky, which should all be 263, are 263, 259, 247, 260, 233, 235, 212, 249, 264, 205, 278, and 265. Invisibility behind the sun, where all the numbers should be 50, 68, 61, 64, 71, 66, 166, 21, 75, 100, 89, and 60. Western appearances, again, we're expecting 263 days if the orbit was circular. 244, 269, 269, 236, 250, 240, 269, 270, 255, and 243. Invisibility in front of the sun, these should all be about 8 days. 3, 20, 16, 3, 7, 272, 11, 6, 46, 15, 4, 16, and 6. Incidentally, the few really rogue numbers will be explained in another video. Now, none of these numbers just mentioned show a circular orbit for Venus. Yet Sagan accepts the changes that his colleague Peter Hubler made to the Venus tablet. Hubler was another antagonist of Velikovsky. The antagonists blamed the, quote, inaccuracies in the Venus tablet on observations made under cloudy conditions or amidst mountainous terrain. But these excuses are illogical because in the course of 12 synodic cycles, the total amount of days should still average to about 584, not the 620 of the Venus tablet. Hubler gave two other reasons for the so-called inaccuracies: smearing of clay tablets, and scribes who in effect were imbeciles when it came to understanding astronomy. And so Hubler made corrections, quote unquote. As James Hogan in Kicking the Sacred Cow points out, we're being asked to believe that the Babylonian astronomers who in some regards achieved observations not matched until the 19th century AD entrusted the copying of their works to scribes who did not know east from west, who hadn't a clue about the workings of astronomy. Hogan points out the revisionist attempts by Peter Hubler. In one place, 5 months, 16 days was changed to 2 months, 6 days. Numerous places in the text where east was written were changed to west, and places where west were written were changed to east. The intercalation of some months were taken out of various years and intercalations put into the text where they don't appear. And even after all those changes, it still didn't match Venus's present orbit. But imagine if some creationist had done all those corrections, quote unquote, to prove some point about the Bible's reliability. Right? He'd be scorned, mocked by evolutionists for abusing the data, and rightly so. The problem that disturbs me most about Sagan blithely telling people the Babylonian records show Venus's orbit is circular is that he actually believes the Venus tablet is an evidence for his view. In other words, he just doesn't think the tablet is one mass of errors by incompetent scribes and therefore useless as a historical document. No, instead he does a complete overhaul so that the tablet matches his preconceived theory and then actually cites the tablet as an evidence for his view. Okay? That's bizarre bias. I can't think of a more astonishing example of self-duplicity. You see, if you don't have the PhDs they have or the professorships at prestigious universities they have, you're only layman. Your thoughts don't matter. They're chimerical. Just get in line with all the other lemmings and listen to us until you walk off the cliff. I'll give my conclusion anyway. The problem today is that history follows science, not science history. And so where there is false science, there will be false history. False history is Sagan telling us the Babylonian record shows a circular orbit for Venus. As the late Christian apologist Francis Schaeffer once noted, the truth will cost you. He's right. You may not get the acceptance you want, the opportunities as a writer or artist you seek, the professorship you were born for. Those are small potatoes compared to what you could lose and may lose in the future. America has entered an unprecedented phase of hostility to the truth. We're in free fall. America hasn't learned the lessons of political history any more than people like Sagan learned the lessons of scientific history. The truth might cost you your freedom and even your life. What is the truth worth to you and to me? Read the New Testament Gospels and the Old Testament Psalms if you haven't already. They will help you understand why the truth is worth following. Next up, why the 360-day year is a big deal, the historical evidence. And part of that evidence is that the 360-day year, which began at creation, lasted until the first ever solar eclipse in 763 BC, predicted 2 years in advance by Amos, an Old Testament prophet.